The glass feels cold in my hand, so cold it almost burns. I watch him across the room, the man who was once my husband, his face draining faster than water from a sieve. The color leaches out, replaced by a sickly gray, like damp concrete. His eyes are wide, fixed on the phone pressed to his ear, but they don't seem to see. They dart around the room, frantic, searching for something that isn't there, something he just lost. The silence in the air is thick, heavier than any sound could ever be. It presses in, suffocating. He makes a small, choked sound, a pathetic gasp that cuts through the stillness, and then his hand trembles, the expensive phone clattering to the floor. It doesn't break. Of course it doesn't. Nothing ever breaks for him, until now. He just stands there, rooted to the spot, a statue carved from pure disbelief and terror. The air around him seems to vibrate with the shockwave of whatever news just hit him. His mouth opens, but no sound comes out. He looks like a fish out of water, gasping, dying, completely and utterly blindsided. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before the gray concrete face and the choked gasp, there was sunlight. There was the golden hour spilling across the oak floors of the house we built, piece by piece, dream by dream. Our life then was a carefully constructed thing, solid and gleaming on the surface. He was a builder in more ways than one. He built businesses, towering structures of steel and glass that scraped the sky. I built the life underneath it. The home, the quiet strength that held him up when the markets were rough, the steady presence that anchored his restless ambition. We met in college, cliché, I know, but it felt like destiny back then. Two young people with fire in their bellies and stars in their eyes. He had the ideas, the relentless drive, the charisma that could charm the paint-off walls. I had the practicality, the organizational mind, the quiet determination to see things through. We were a team. He'd brainstorm late into the night, pacing the floor, sketching plans on napkins, and I'd be there listening, refining, turning abstract concepts into concrete steps. I managed the early finances, the payroll for the first few employees, the endless permits and paperwork that came with building something real. While he was out shaking hands, making deals, being the face of the operation, I was the invisible scaffolding, ensuring the structure didn't collapse. His first big break came with a risky project no one else wanted. I remember the sleepless nights, the fear churning in our stomachs, the way we'd huddle together on the sofa, going over spreadsheets again and again, searching for a hidden flaw or a glimmer of hope. We poured everything into it, our savings, our time, every ounce of our energy. When that project finally paid off, spectacularly, it felt like we'd conquered the world together. The business exploded after that. He became a name, a force. The small office grew into floors of glass and steel in the city's financial district. Our modest house became this sprawling property with manicured lawns and a view that stretched to the horizon. He worked constantly, driven by a hunger that seemed insatiable. Sometimes I miss the early days, the shared struggle, the feeling of being equals building something from the ground up. Now he was the CEO, the visionary, and I was the wife, the supportive partner. I managed the household staff, organized the charity galas, maintained the perfect facade of a successful man's perfect life. I still looked over contracts sometimes, offered advice on hires, but my role was less active, more ornamental. I told myself it was okay. He was providing, securing our future, living the dream we'd built together. His ambition was for us. That's what I believed. Utterly. Completely. Blindly. We talked about the future. Retirement homes by the coast, traveling the world when he finally decided to slow down, grandchildren running through the house. These weren't just idle dreams. They were woven into the fabric of our conversations, the silent understanding of a life shared, a path walked together. He'd look at me sometimes, across a crowded room at one of those galas, and give me that old smile, the one that reached his eyes, and for a second, I'd see the boy I fell in love with, and all the distance his success had created would melt away. I trusted him implicitly. His business was our business. His money was our money. We were a unit, a fortress against the world. The idea that he would ever deliberately build walls between us, let alone use those walls to trap me, was unthinkable. It was a foundation of rock, or so I thought. It turns out, it was just elaborate stage paint on a rotten floorboard. The first crack was almost imperceptible. A late night that wasn't about a deal closing. A weekend conference that felt off. Little things. A new cologne I didn't recognize, too sweet, too floral for him. A sudden obsession with his appearance, new suits, perfect hair, a glow that wasn't just about closing deals. My gut tightened, a cold knot forming deep inside. I pushed it down. He was under pressure. Business was booming, but that brought its own stress. He was probably just trying to look his best for important clients. I rationalized, I excused, I buried the unease under layers of denial and forced optimism. Then came the phone. Always with him. Always face down. It used to be just a tool, buzzing with emails and calls about construction sites and investor meetings. Now it was a silent, secretive extension of himself. He'd take it to the other room for calls. He'd clear his notifications religiously. One evening, he left it on the kitchen counter while he stepped out to take a call on the landline, an old habit he only reverted to when he wanted complete privacy. The screen lit up with a notification. A message from an app one didn't use. Curiosity, a dark, unwelcome guest, gnawed at me. I knew I shouldn't, but the knot in my gut had become a sharp, twisting pain. I picked it up. The message wasn't hidden. It was right there on the lock screen. A name I didn't recognize, followed by words that punched the air from my lungs. Can't wait to see you tonight. Planning our future, my hand shook so violently, I almost dropped the phone. The room spun. The beautiful, expensive kitchen, the symbol of our success, suddenly felt sterile and alien. I unlocked the phone, my fingers fumbling, driven by a desperate, morbid need to know. And there it was. A torrent of messages, stretching back months. Names, dates, plans. Pet names that made me sick. Inside jokes I wasn't a part of. A parallel life, vibrant and real, lived entirely without me. My husband, my partner, the man who built our life, was simultaneously building another one, tearing mine down brick by brick. The messages weren't just about sex. They were about feelings, about hopes, about a future. The future he discussed with me, he was discussing with her. My world didn't just crack. It shattered into a million jagged pieces, raining down on me, cutting deep. I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of my life, holding the evidence of its demolition in my hand. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, a feeling that went beyond betrayal. It was the dawning horror of realizing the person you've anchored your entire existence to is a stranger, capable of an unimaginable cruelty. The first few days were a blur of pain and disbelief. He came back, saw me standing there with his phone, and his face fell. Not with remorse, but with annoyance. Like I'd just ruined his evening. He tried to lie, of course. Pathetic, transparent lies about a client relationship, a misunderstanding. When that didn't work, he got angry. Accused me of snooping, of not trusting him, turning the blame back on me with a practiced ease that chilled me to the bone. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a defensive, cornered animal. We talked, or rather, we circled each other, spitting accusations and justifications like venom.
I cried, I pleaded, I demanded answers.
He remained distant, cold. The vulnerability he'd shown in the early days was gone, replaced by a steely resolve I'd only ever seen him use in business negotiations. He admitted it, eventually, with a sigh, like he was confessing to a minor inconvenience. Yes, he was seeing someone. Yes, it had been going on for a while. No, he didn't want to end it. My heart didn't just break. It calcified in that moment. Then came the cold, hard reality check. We had assets, significant assets, tied up in his business, in properties, in investments. Assets I had contributed to, not just emotionally but practically, in the early years. Assets that represented the future we had built together. When I tentatively brought up separation, a divorce, he didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, focusing with that familiar business intensity. "We'll figure something out," he'd said, but his tone lacked any warmth, any reassurance. It was a dismissal. I started talking to lawyers. The first few consultations were demoralizing, because the business was structured as a complex web of LLCs and partnerships, largely set up after we were married, but specifically designed to protect his interests and limit liability. My claim on the business assets was complicated. "It's his," one lawyer told me plainly. "The money flows through it, but the equity, the control, that's largely protected. You'll get a settlement, of course, based on marital property, but touching the core business? That's going to be an uphill battle. Very expensive, very uncertain." Uphill battle. Expensive. Uncertain. The words echoed in the vast, empty rooms of the house. He held all the cards. The legal structures he'd spent years perfecting to protect his empire from competitors and creditors were now being weaponized against me. He knew it. I saw it in his eyes. A quiet confidence, almost pity. He had built his castle, and he was showing me I was locked outside the main keep, granted only the scraps he deemed fit to throw over the walls. He started making subtle moves, cutting off access to joint accounts that weren't strictly necessary for household expenses, redirecting mail, talking about his needs, his future, as if I was a relic of a past life he was eager to discard. The financial pressure began to mount, a slow, insidious squeeze designed to make me desperate, compliant. He wanted me to agree to his terms, to walk away quietly with whatever settlement he dictated, leaving his empire, his real love, intact. The mistress wasn't hidden anymore either. He wasn't bringing her home. Not yet, but there were public sightings, whispers among the few mutual friends we had left. It felt like a deliberate provocation, a performance for an audience of one me. He was flaunting his new life, his freedom, rubbing salt into the gaping wound. Every sighting, every whisper, was a turn of the screw, a reminder of my powerlessness. My early attempts to fight back felt weak, futile. My initial lawyer, competent but cautious, advised a strategy of negotiation, of trying to reach an agreement. But there was no basis for agreement. He wanted to give me crumbs from his feast, and I wasn't ready to starve quietly. I changed lawyers, seeking someone more aggressive, but the message was similar. The business structure was a formidable shield. We could fight for a bigger share of the other assets, the houses, the investments outside the core company, but attacking the heart of the beast was a long shot. One evening, I was packing some of his things, a necessary task that felt like packing up a stranger's belongings, when his phone buzzed on the dresser. He was in the shower. It was her name on the screen. Usually, I looked away, steeling myself against the fresh wave of nausea and pain. But tonight, something was different. The constant pressure, the deliberate humiliation, had burned away the hurt, leaving behind a cold, hard core of something else. Determination. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to see their sickening endearments. But her name, linked to him, to his life, his business, sparked a thought. What did she know about his business? How involved was she? Was she just a trophy, or was she part of the plan? A new angle began to form, shadowy at first, then sharper, clearer. If he was discussing his future with her, was he discussing his business future? His financial strategies? His plans for handling the divorce, for protecting his wealth? I began to dig, not just into his personal life, but into the edges of his professional one. I remembered things from the early days, names of minor partners, former employees who had left on bad terms, quirks in the business structure that he'd explained to me years ago. I started cross-referencing information, looking for connections between his personal deceit and his professional maneuvering. It was slow, painstaking work, like sifting through mountains of sand to find a single grain of gold. The turning point, the moment the ice in my veins truly solidified, came unexpectedly. I was meeting with my lawyer, going over the depressing assessment of my financial prospects. We were in her office, a sterile room with city views that mocked my situation.
My phone rang.
It was his number. I hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker at my lawyer's subtle nod. He rarely called me directly anymore, preferring his lawyer to communicate. He sounded rushed, agitated, probably on his way to meet her. He didn't realize my lawyer was listening. He started talking about arrangements for something, a car, some furniture. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Don't worry about any of it," he said, talking to someone else in the background, presumably her. His voice was loud enough that my lawyer could hear every word. "She can't touch my money now. Everything important is locked up tight in the holding companies. She'll get the house and some walking around money, but the real wealth? It's safe. She built nothing. I built everything. She's got nothing on me." He hung up before I could even process the full weight of his words. He had been talking to her, boasting about his financial impregnability because of the legal structures he had built, structures I had been told were insurmountable. And he said it with such casual cruelty, such absolute certainty. My blood ran cold, then boiled. That casual dismissal, she built nothing. After all the years, the sacrifice, the invisible work. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was utter contempt. He saw me as a non-entity, easily discarded, legally powerless. My lawyer, across the desk, looked at me, her expression grim. "He just admitted he's deliberately structured assets to avoid marital claims," she said softly. On speakerphone. To his mistress, within earshot of us. "He thinks it makes him untouchable. That kind of arrogance often leads to mistakes." In that moment, sitting in that cold office, listening to his voice echo in my mind, "She can't touch my money now. She built nothing. She's got nothing on me." A switch flipped. The pain was still there, a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a cold, calculating fury. He thought he was so smart, so protected by his paper fortresses. He thought I was weak, ignorant, easily defeated. He was wrong. He had spent years building his empire, meticulously layering legal entities, offshore accounts, complex holding structures designed to be impenetrable. He thought he had created a labyrinth where his true wealth could hide, safe from taxes, creditors, and inconvenient wives. What he hadn't accounted for was that I had been there at the beginning. I knew the initial framework. I knew the purpose behind some of those early, seemingly innocuous decisions. And I had spent the last few weeks quietly, relentlessly researching. My research hadn't focused on finding hidden accounts, which was nearly impossible given his expertise in camouflage. Instead, I focused on the structure itself, on the laws governing how those entities interacted, how they were funded, how they transferred money between them. I looked for weaknesses in the design, not just hidden pockets of cash. And his boast, delivered with such arrogant confidence, had just given me a massive clue. He was so sure I couldn't touch the holding companies. Why? What specifically about those companies made him feel so secure? I changed lawyers again, this time seeking someone who specialized not just in divorce, but in complex financial litigation and corporate structures. I found her. She was sharp, analytical, with eyes that missed nothing. I brought her everything I had. Years of financial statements I'd quietly kept copies of, emails, contracts I'd helped draft in the early days, and a detailed account of my early involvement in the business. Crucially, I told her about the phone call. His boast. His specific mention of the holding companies. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Then, she started asking questions. Deep, probing questions about the flow of money, the relationships between the various entities, the timing of certain transfers, the registered addresses of the holding companies. We spent days, then weeks, dissecting his empire on paper. It was like reverse engineering a complex machine built to obscure its own function. Slowly, a picture emerged. He hadn't just built a protective structure, he had built an incredibly aggressive one. To minimize tax liability and future claims, like mine, he had systematically moved revenue and assets into these holding companies, often using complex intercompany loans and agreements that existed mostly on paper. He was leveraging the legal separation between the operating business and the holding companies to the absolute maximum. His blind spot, my lawyer realized, was his own overconfidence. He was so focused on making the holding companies untouchable, on making it look like the operating business was merely servicing debts to these separate entities, that he had potentially violated rules governing the legitimate flow of funds between related corporate bodies. He had prioritized making the money disappear from the operating company, where I had a clearer claim, into the holding companies, where he thought it was safe, to such an extreme degree that the financial logic of the operating business itself was dangerously distorted. It was like he'd starved one part of his body to gorge another, assuming the starved part could still function indefinitely. We found the angle. It wasn't about proving he'd hidden money, though that was happening. It was about arguing that the entire structure, particularly the relationship between the operating companies and the holding companies he'd bragged about, was fundamentally flawed and potentially fraudulent in its deliberate attempt to mislead and to prejudice marital claims. We weren't just going after his money. We were going after the integrity of the structure that held all his money. The decisive move wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a surgical strike. My lawyer filed a motion for an emergency injunction to freeze the assets and operations of not just the operating companies, but the holding companies as well, pending a full investigation and resolution of the marital estate. The grounds were complex, alleging not just standard asset division issues, but potential corporate malfeasance related to the manipulation of funds specifically to defraud a spouse, using his own boasts as evidence of intent. We also highlighted how his actions were potentially jeopardizing the operating company itself by siphoning off necessary capital. The risk was immense. If the motion failed, it would be seen as an aggressive, baseless attack, potentially incurring severe penalties and strengthening his position. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, targeting the very foundation of his perceived invincibility. Every fiber of my being screamed with tension in the days that followed. I went through the motions of daily life, a serene mask hiding the storm raging inside. He seemed oblivious, still basking in the glow of his perceived victory, making plans with his mistress for a future he thought was secured behind his legal walls. He had no idea the ground beneath those walls was about to crumble. And then the storm broke. The court ruled. The judge, presented with our detailed arguments, the financial analysis, and the compelling, arrogant evidence of his own words on speakerphone, agreed that there was sufficient prima facie evidence of potential wrongdoing and, crucially, a significant risk that he would continue to manipulate assets. The order was sweeping. It froze the bank accounts of the operating companies and, more devastatingly for him, the holding companies. It required an immediate, independent forensic audit of all intertwined entities. It prohibited the transfer of funds, the sale of significant assets, or the initiation of any new projects without explicit court approval. For a business built on constant cash flow, rapid investment, and complex, opaque transactions, it was a death sentence. It didn't just freeze his money, it froze the engine of his empire. It brought his entire world to a grinding halt. That's when I saw him. The scene from the beginning. The gray face, the trembling hand, the phone clattering to the floor. He was in his office conference room. I wasn't supposed to be there, not anymore, but I had insisted on retrieving a few personal items. I walked past the open door just as he got the call from his lawyer. He was standing by the massive window, the city he had conquered spread out behind him. And then the color drained, the eyes widened, the soundless gasp escaped his lips. He didn't see me. He didn't see anything but the sudden, terrifying void where his power used to be. His lawyer's voice, tinny and distorted through the phone's speaker on the floor, carried faintly into the hall. Injunction granted. Total freeze. Auditors arriving tomorrow. Every account. Every entity. How did she? His lawyer was scrambling, confused, blindsided. Because this wasn't just a bigger divorce settlement. This was an attack on the very structure he believed was untouchable. He thought I couldn't touch his money and the holding companies. He was right.
I didn't touch the money.
I locked it all down. Every single cent, in every single company, operating or holding. He collapsed then, not physically hitting the floor, but his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table, as if it were the only thing holding him up. The conqueror of the city, reduced to a broken man clinging to a piece of furniture. He had been so certain, so arrogant in his belief that he had outsmarted me, outmaneuvered the system. His boast, "She can't touch my money now," wasn't just wrong. It was the unintentional roadmap I had followed to his precise point of vulnerability. He had meticulously detailed the location of his perceived fortress, and in doing so, had shown me exactly where to plant the charge. His own words, spoken in contemptuous confidence to his mistress, had become the key piece of evidence used to dismantle his empire. The aftermath wasn't a sudden explosion of joy. It was quiet. A deep, bone-weary quiet. The legal battle continued, of course, but the power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. With the business frozen, his leverage evaporated. He couldn't make deals, couldn't access capital, couldn't project the image of unstoppable success that was so vital to his identity and his ongoing operations. Clients got nervous. Partners started looking for exits. The intricate structure he'd built began to unravel under the sudden, intense scrutiny. He tried to fight back, to paint me as vengeful, as destroying his livelihood out of spite. But the court order stood. The forensic audit proceeded. And as the auditors peeled back the layers, they found more than just aggressive asset protection. The lines between his personal finances and the business had been blurred in ways that were questionable, at best. Funds had been diverted for personal use, for the mistress's lavish expenses, sometimes in ways that skirted or crossed legal lines. He hadn't just been hiding money from me, he'd been playing a dangerous game with the business itself. He called me eventually. His voice was different. Gone was the arrogance, the cold dismissal. It was replaced by a strained desperation. He pleaded. He cajoled. He offered settlements far more generous than anything previously discussed if only I would lift the injunction. He even tried to play the victim, talking about his legacy, the jobs, the people who depended on his business. I listened, my face impassive. The man on the other end of the line was a stranger. The boy I loved, the partner I built a life with, was long gone. I remembered his face in the office, the way he crumpled. I remembered his words to his mistress, the cruel confidence that had wounded me so deeply. She built nothing. I built everything. She's got nothing on me. You built it on sand, I said finally, my voice steady and calm. And you built it by tearing someone else down. I didn't agree to lift the injunction. Not until a full, equitable settlement was reached, one that accounted for my contribution, my years, my loss, and the blatant attempt to defraud me. The legal process ground on for months, but the outcome was inevitable. His business, starved of oxygen and choked by scrutiny, never fully recovered. Deals collapsed, projects stalled, reputation was tarnished. The empire crumbled, not in a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing disintegration. I walked away with a significant portion of the marital assets, including a share of what was recovered from the frozen accounts, enough to ensure my financial independence for the rest of my life. It wasn't just walking around money, it was security. It was freedom. I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. There was a deep, abiding sadness for the years lost, for the man I thought I married, for the future that evaporated. But there was also a quiet, fierce sense of vindication. He had underestimated me completely. He had mistaken my quiet support for weakness, my trust for naivety. He had built his fortress out of paper and lies, and his own arrogance had left the blueprint lying in plain sight. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I had nothing. But I had listened. I had learned. And in the end, his own words, his own perceived strength, became the instrument of his undoing. The house felt different after he was gone. Lighter, somehow. The sunlight still spills across the oak floors, but now it feels like my own. The silence isn't heavy with dread anymore. It's peaceful. I walk through the rooms, and I don't see the ghost of a life I thought I had. I see the space for a new one. It's a strange kind of victory. It cost me years, heartache, and the shattering of illusions. But I reclaimed my ground. I showed him, and myself, that you can be quiet, you can be supportive, you can be underestimated, and still possess the strength, the intelligence, and the cold resolve to fight for what is rightfully yours. He built walls of paper, confident they were impenetrable. He never imagined I would bring the fire. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.